RevOps AF, the only podcast for people who are RevOps AF and want to learn all about things that are RevOps AF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers.
Hello and welcome to RevOps AF, the podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Kamala Thompson, and today I am joined by Joe DeGrande. Joe, tell us about yourself.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Kamala. And yeah, Joe DeGrande. I'm the former VP of Sales and Customer Success at Business Insider, but I've actually gone full on my consultancy full time at Joe Does Tech Touch, kind of helping teams with their RevOps and customer success ops operations and helping them scale post-sales and building out Tech Touch and digital CS programs. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, so glad to have you here. And I feel sometimes like we can skew really heavily in the sales direction. So excited to have somebody with a lot of CS chops in their background, which is why we're talking about CS automation today. Let's talk about automation. And when I think about automation in CS, it's not so much all the things you can do. I think about all the things people want to immediately do instead of some of the things they maybe should do first. Why do you think when it comes to automation that we jump straight to inventing problems?
Yes. It's a good point. I see it a lot too. When tech starts to come up, they start to kind of get the shiny object syndrome, especially AI. They get caught up in what you can do, focusing on the problems that they have at hand. Even with AI and automation, people forget about how to actually get it going. It's data first. And similar to even on the sales side, you can't really automate unless you have clean and accurate data. And I'd say that's always the first step that's kind of forgotten. But at the same time, it is also focusing on those challenges that you currently have. The small wins can really have a huge impact, or at least to kind of prove that business case.
So, before we jump into the data problem, where do you really recommend that people start when it comes to figuring out what they're going to do with automation?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good call out. It's 5 stages, right? It's focusing on your target customer for a automated program, right? You can automate any type of account segment, whether it's enterprise, SMB, mid-market, but just starting out, you should figure out like, hey, here's my sub-segment, whether I like to use long tail customers, typically higher volume, lower ARR. If that's how your organization has those customers, that's great because it's a good proving ground. And then from there, you would kind of say, all right, what's currently working, whether it's that particular segment or maybe another segment, and then kind of scale it back or try to get it more scalable, actually, is what I'm looking for. But starting there can help, and then focusing on those challenges. So if you're going back to the example you gave, right, whether it's a 15-step renewal sequence or so on, I like telling people like, all right, what is your ultimate KPI for that given moment, or maybe holistically for the year, right? You might have a challenge where there is not enough people supporting the implementation or the onboarding for that sub-segment of accounts. Great. That might be a place to start. Maybe it's time to value. If it is a more revenue-focused function, which I believe it should be, then it might be those renewals. So taking a look back at how many customers are maybe coming up for renewal, larger segments coming up within the next 180 days, you might want to prioritize those. So it's one, building out that segment, but also taking a step back and understanding what your KPIs are, and then you could start to build it out.
Cool. And how do you feel about starting with some internal facing automations?
It's a good place to start for sure. A lot of times, especially now, customer success has they've fallen into the trap of like the catch-all, where they're focusing on a lot of different responsibilities. Some organizations have the customer success manager focusing on implementation, right? Sometimes that could be at a different company where it's an implementation team entirely, or a solutions engineer and so on. So CSM could be focused on that after they're implemented. So the entire life cycle, renewal, upsell, even in some cases, which is a challenge, support. So as far as like the actual manual processes, try to figure out, all right, what are those pieces maybe that they're taking the most time and that's tedious, seeing how you could prompt stuff up to them. If it is sequencing, maybe it's just prompting it and not automatically sending it. It's just queuing it up for them. Hey, we think you should be sending this email or this in-app announcement or in-app messaging to that customer, but we want you to review it for us first. Similar to sales in terms of outbound outreach, but you're just queuing it up, making it a lot more efficient. In addition to that, another use case might be, hey, an account is at risk. Here's a playbook you should be following, not necessarily sending any sort of communication to a customer or a phone call, but it's like, hey, here are the steps that you should be taking as, based on the guidance of your manager. They're going to kind of set that vision. There's a lot less risk when you're automating the manual processes, but internally prompting them to make sure they work too. I think that's a huge takeaway there. But yeah, it can have a pretty big impact of serving that information rather than to the actual rep as opposed to the customer at first.
Yeah, and I especially like that if you're trying to layer in AI messaging and
Oh yeah.
it's a good proving ground. So let's dig into data quality. And I think a lot of folks perhaps tuning in have a heavy sales focus. And, we've probably got the account firmographic data fairly well nailed down.
Hmm.
What does CS need to get the ball rolling and then do their job well going forward?
Yeah, it's interesting because the firmographic data, typically you would hopefully have that information from the sales side. So I view that as, of course, your third party data, right? You're probably getting it from another source. Maybe you updated it internally, but to kind of enrich it over time, you want to make sure it's always up to date by another source. I would say it's then the first party data, which is really what's going to be key. What do I mean by that? Your product usage, for one. That's going to be key. And product usage can be flipped into two different ways. It could be obviously how the account is doing, as well as the particular end user and how they're doing. And then similarly on the RevOps side is the data transformation as well, right? So we talk about maybe last login date, something as simple as that, or maybe they engage with a particular feature within the product. Now, how are you actually transforming that data to say, like, maybe it's a health score, right? Or maybe it's a way you're identifying a persona for an particular end user, right? Maybe someone who's inactive versus a power user. So there's those different buckets as well. However, taking it a step back, if you're just starting out to automate, what I like to do is looking at your contract dates. Very simple, at least in theory. And if you don't, that should be your first step, is understand when does the contract start and when does it end? Because in theory, at least bare bones, what should be happening within the first 90 days of the subscription? What should be happening at the midpoint of 180 and then 90 days before the contract renewal? You kind of guesstimate what should be happening based on what was already working on your larger accounts or just your strategy in general, and then start to automate what should be happening, whether it's externally or internally as well.
I love that call out for two reasons. One, in a survey with PandaDoc, I'm analyzing a lot of their data and was floored at how few revenue operations teams analyze product usage data.
Mm.
And I think there's probably a couple of things that go into that. One, they rarely own it. It's usually like the BI team that owns the data.
Yep.
And I think some assumptions get made sometimes that CS already has access to that. Don't assume that, please.
Yeah.
For the love of all that's good.
Yes.
Oof.
It's a tough one. And I've even seen a product teams own them in a silo themselves. And it's challenging. And then it's, where does it also live is another issue as well, as far as how you're piping it out, right? Similar stuff on the RevOps side. It might live in a platform like Pendo, where you're tracking those events. And now you have to figure out, all right, how do I engineer this to, whether hopefully it's a native integration, but if not, you might have to use
Build an
API connections
iframe or
and, bring it into whatever you're going to use for automation. The BI team, honestly, even I have in conversations, it's sometimes even forgotten about too, as far as that they might own it, because again, I try to tell teams, like, they automating a piece of automation that is a good use case is automating like QBRs or value reviews or however you want to define it. I tell them, hey, actually go to your BI team, because they probably have that data that you need if they're reporting it up to whatever C-level executives, the board, etc. It is a challenge, and it's sometimes often forgotten about, that the CS team does, or post-sales needs it for sure.
So let's go back to first party data for a moment, because
Sure.
there's so many things I think we need to hit on here. I see in too many companies that CS is fairly neglected in my experience. The onboarding process doesn't always get a ton of attention from somebody who's emotionally removed and able to look at things kind of more objectively. So I think it's a fantastic place for RevOps to at least observe and see how they've got it structured and what information is or is not making it over. Because I find so many times when you sit down and talk to CS people, particularly if you have an onboarding process or something along those lines, the core complaint is sales doesn't tell us anything.
Mm,
So when you're working with a client or on an engagement, what are the types of information you're focused on as part of the onboarding process and making sure CS has what they need?
yeah, that's actually a really good call out. I hear this challenge time in and time out. Basically, the pass off from sales and CS, it's been lacking, and I believe there's a ton of systematic changes you can make. Obviously, there's a leadership component with that as well, right? Making sure that both teams are aligned. But let's say focusing on the system side, you could also do a ton of required fields for whether it's closing out an opportunity, and then that's obviously synced up to an account transfer doc or so on. So that way that's passed over to the customer success team in which they can effectively do their job, right? It all depends on the type of data. Some key things, obviously your standard stuff. When is the renewal going to happen? When does it expire? So that they could also strategically figure out where it falls within their book. But even a matter of like contact roles is so crucial and often forgotten about. Who's your day-to-day contact for implementing the solution if it's a very technical solution? Who's actually your decision maker? Who is the person that went up to bat internally within that organization to make sure the deal was pushed through? And who's your actual financial contact, whether it's accounting, billing, accounts payable, and so on. Often missed and forgotten about. If you're going into a more technical piece, you could focus on, if it's a tool that needs to be integrated with a ton of solutions, what are some of those tools within their tech stack that they need to keep in mind? Or maybe rank them in terms of priority as well, based on their use cases. Use cases should be something that should be automatically sent to the customer success team so that they can focus on those use cases and incorporating that into their time to value metric. Time to value is another piece where it could get a little convoluted based on how the company defines it. It should always be tied back to the customer. But nevertheless, it's again, focusing on the fields that you need based on your product. Those are some of them, but also too making sure that you have that alignment as well cross-functionally. On the RevOps side, setting up those requirements should be pretty straightforward. Again, you need that leadership approval, but making sure that they don't move, creating that friction, they don't move to the next step. And then of course the sales team is great because they're obviously going to be focused on making sure that they get their commission. So they're going to want to update whatever needs to be updated within Salesforce, HubSpot, etc., in order to make sure they get paid.
Yeah, and actually, that can be tough because I want to use the C word, which is clawbacks, for those of you who are like, what? In some organizations, revenue recognition is really dependent upon the product getting started, and that's what sales is waiting for to get paid commissions. In smaller organizations, they don't always have that mechanism, so there isn't as much of an incentive for the salespeople to stick around and make sure all the bows are tied. And it's hard to get people to do something if it's just the right thing for the company. So, really thinking through and helping your leaders think through what the ramifications are for not getting CS and sales together and talking, or at least transferring goals and information that they have to collect during the sales process anyway. And it's so hard in revenue operations to introduce a lot of friction with field requirements. I think that's always something can we manage around this instead of validation rules?
True.
What have you seen work in terms of helping the sales team understand the impact of not packaging up that information and passing it on to CS?
Yeah, it's actually, I have a pretty good example of that. During my time, I was at an organization running a full-on tech touch account management motion, or known more commonly today as digital CS. It was crucial that we had the right information because that entire book of business, around 80% of it was managed with automation. When I say automation, it was outbound or external. Emails being fired. There was a help center that was also available to them. So we had to make sure that it was up to date. How we got them to understand the impact, it was definitely a leadership kind of jumping into the mix. At that time, it was just initially me meeting them, having them understand our business. So at that organization, we had always new people coming in. Sales, I mean, it's just kind of the nature of that particular function, right? There's always new people coming in and out. There's a lot of turnover depending wherever you're at. So we would kind of whether it's a quarterly or biannual basis, talk to the team. Like, hey, here's how the Tech Touch team is doing. And here's also, if you're new to Tech Touch, what the impact is. And then we kind of said, like, this is why this XYZ field is important, or mainly your decision makers and your day-to-day contacts. And I think one that was pretty common, that was a challenge, it was hard to get around that particular time, was contract dates. I remember on some occasions where people would update contract dates again when they close out their ops, and either, I forget what it was, maybe they put the same year, and then all of the emails would fire off all at once because it's trying to catch it. So we had to nip it quick.
Surprisingly easy to do.
Oh yeah, 100%. But
yeah.
But at any rate, yeah, it was a couple of meetings with the team, kind of, and of course, like, be collaborative with them, right? Like, we would also say, like, that our team actually resided within sales ops. That's how we had it coined in our team at the time. So we would say, like, hey, how can we make this easier for you for updating within, Salesforce was our CRM. So we would kind of, again, try to figure out solutions too to understand the core issue. Some of it was just pure, just unfortunately lack of care, and they just focused on closing the deals. But, it's a balance.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to set realistic expectations with
Of
both
course.
sides. I remember working on this onboarding project where we were facing a lot of churn later on, but it was because of the onboarding process and not understanding the goals and aligning
Yes.
everybody. So what we ended up doing was I asked the CS team, like, what information would be helpful? They're like, great question. Here's a 48 field form we'd like you to require for sales. And I'm like, oh, that's not realistic. So how
course.
about we meet in the middle? Right now you're
Yes.
getting nothing. What are the 6 things?
Of course.
Like crawl, walk, run, crawl, walk, run. But it was also on the CS side, having that conversation that you're still going to have a call with the customer with this technical of a product
Oh, yeah.
and verify a bunch of stuff. But the
course.
sales team should be part of that for the first call. You should meet ahead of time,
Yes.
get aligned on some stuff. Like, it just depends on how technical the product is.
100%. Yeah. I think collaboration is key, and they should definitely be involved as opposed to just like a total dump. It's like, oh, here you go. I did my job.
Wipe your hands. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, circling back to the data, one of the highest priorities for me is always contract information.
Yes.
Because I think of it in terms of what do we need to know in order to not embarrass ourselves in front of the customer?
It's a good way of thinking of it.
Yeah. And then we work out from there. So, not embarrassing, your primary contact, the contract start and end date, the
Yes.
expectations that have been set around when they're going to go live, pretty basic information. What would you categorize either in there that I've missed or like steps down from that?
As far as from the base, like the things that you really
How
should
do you
know.
think about categorizing the priority? Like, what do you fix first, second, third? I know the right answer is always it depends on the organization you're working
Sure.
with. But in general, like priority wise.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say number one priority, you're right, it's your contract information, because it is so bad if you're working with a customer and you get it wrong. It's like, you don't know what I pay for, or if I paid, or how much I pay, and I don't have the contract, coming from the customer. So yeah, contract data and like the contract, overall contract information, your points of contact, those are going to be key. I would then say it is we could actually even take it a layer deeper. It's your usage data, right? But it's also how you're able to track like end users. So it's not even just like, all right, when someone logged in. I've seen it time and time again where I'll work with customers and they don't have a way to track who their users are. Like, they'll have it maybe in the back end, but that stuff should also, especially if you're going to launch automation, should live in a CRM or a CSP, whatever that is. So having some automation and understanding of like, hey, this is an end user, and have it automatically fire to your CRM. You're not backlogging and updating. So how that falls, like I would say that's a priority for sure, to making sure that you're tracking who's actually engaging with your product. Then it's like a sub bullet of the actual engagement. And then it's the third bucket where it's, in my opinion, it's that transformation, right? Where you actually have an analyst look at like, hey, who is a power user, who's an inactive user, an actual health score that is dictated. And again, that's a whole nother debate on whether they actually work and so on, but you still want to have a general idea of someone's healthy or not. But it all stems around data transformation. And that's like where you're pulling in different data sources, right? Whether like that might be, hey, how have they engaged in the product? But maybe it's not as much, and maybe they haven't actually engaged with us. Like the most last inbound activity from them, like from an email or however you communicate, was within the past 90 days. We haven't heard from them. That might be a red flag. But that all comes down to transforming all those data sources together. The other piece too, that's not, we kind of touched on it. It's the actual understanding of how the data is updated. So that's another piece where, is it a person? Is it a system? And making sure you get some familiarity on it. And then there might be some efficiencies there too. But that's also a very important piece when you're kind of doing this essentially like data gap analysis or audit.
Yeah. And then when you're doing this audit, I always recommend what's the margin of error we're comfortable with.
True.
There's some things that's not acceptable, like the wrong contract end date.
Yes.
We need to figure out how to get that right all the time. But we know, for example, someone's mobile number might not be right, but
Yeah.
maybe the email has to be right.
Yes.
I don't know. It's
Yeah.
something you have to negotiate within your own organization. I loved your call out on the health scores because I haven't been touching on it because I'm like, that's a whole other podcast episode.
It's, yeah, health scores. I think AI is going to have a big play in it, not to jump on the bandwagon there. I'm very curious to see how there's a lot of companies in the space that are tackling it, but it's not just this like wave a magic wand concept. Every company is going to be different in terms of what success looks like to them and how we, as a company, vendor, perceive success. And there's a lot of ways to manipulate the data to figure out what, if a customer is healthy or not. But yeah, it's a tough topic to dive into.
Oh my God, it's so hard. And I see so many companies trying their best by doing these surveys that are hyper focused on how do you like the person you're working with?
Mm.
For example, Verizon. They're on my list right now because I had a rough week with them. I was upgrading my phone. They sent me the wrong device that they entered. Spent an hour and a half on with 4 different support representatives.
Oh,
Went to the store to turn in my own old phone for the upgrade, and none of them had straightened out the issue with the device numbers being different. So I had to schedule an appointment and come back
oh
in
boy.
order to be able to turn in.
Right.
Fortunately, the good thing they do is they also ask, okay, how was your experience with Verizon as a whole? And that's where I can be like, ha ha ha. So if you do anything different on your surveys, please do ask about your product.
True. It is so true. It's interesting though too with the company. I'm fully with you. I've had some poor experience with a lot of tools recently. That's a whole other thing too. I feel like AI has also put a damper on customer support. But as far as going back to, I forgot what I was going to say initially, but it's going back to the brand. I've even seen where some customers will give a poor score to the brand because they're in the moment. Or it might be an end user, right? If we're talking about a larger organization or so on, and it just might be a rage click at that moment. Your experience, I'm sure that's a rough one, but let's say it's maybe a product feature doesn't work and they got served coincidentally the NPS or customer satisfaction score survey, and they just hit 0 or whatever scoring methodology is there, and they've been a customer for 10 years and so on. What I tell people is like, this brings back your first party, third party data together. Who is that person that actually submitted the score? Oh, that's the VP of XYZ company and he was our decision maker. That's a red flag. And that's where you kind of have to dig deeper. And that might not be the biggest indication, but it's certainly something that you should call out when you're doing your scoring or even your automation in general, like flagging it to a particular rep. But yeah, there's so many different ways and scenarios that kind of have an impact on customer dissatisfaction.
So circling back to, I think we've hit on some examples of how this impacts automation, the
Yeah.
data piece. What are some other best practices or things you've done that you have learned to avoid that you wish people would think through when they're thinking automation?
Understanding your data obviously is key, right? And taking that step back into those buckets, right? Just to kind of as a review, it's understanding where your data lives, what data that you have, is it accurate, and can you rely on it? And what I mean by that is like, is it just available, right? I tell somebody as simple as going in Salesforce and seeing, hey, out of the percentage of accounts that I want to run through this play, how many of those fields are actually updated or are they completely null and just blank? Okay.
I see it all the time with lead scoring too, where I'm
Oh,
like, oh, you
oh
screw up your
yeah.
score with something that's not even available.
Yes, exactly. And then the worst is when someone goes and builds out this fancy play. I'm going to build out this journey, and then they realize they just don't have it. And that's such a miss. So I would say it's that, right? Understanding where it is, also how it's ingested. I was actually and how my own podcast, which we didn't talk about, we'll talk about at the end, but is the understanding of how different objects behave with different platforms. So for example, if you have a custom object in, or maybe an opportunity in Salesforce, your marketing platform might not be able to ingest the information there. You might have to copy it and send it to the account or contact page. So understanding that piece of it too. And then of course, the process. Who's updating what? Is it a system? Is it a person? Does the if it's a sales team, do they know that that's expected of them? Maybe you have a couple of great eggs that just have been doing it, and then a new person comes on and they're not being trained properly, and then you're basing this whole strategy on that. I would say that's the biggest piece of it, is just understanding how your data flows, how it works. It's not a matter of who goes in the program. It's a matter of who you do not want in that automation. I accidentally emailed the CEO's wife when I was first starting. I was just starting out in my career. Thankfully, it was a good email. It was like about training for an organization to get your access. Totally irrelevant, but again, it goes back to me not understanding the data, or it was a mishap. So if you take a step back and figure out like, hey, who would blow this up? Essentially, like if it's all goes wrong, start with who you do not want in that program, whether it might be a blocker in a particular case with an account. Want to make sure that they don't get annoyed with automation, that you're reaching out to end users. So that's where I kind of like to start, and then start to figure out, okay, how do I bring in the people that I actually want? So that's kind of my approach there.
Yeah, exclusion logic is
Yeah.
very important. Very
Yes.
important. And a point you made earlier, I would just like to hammer home again
Yeah.
is you talked about starting with a subset of the population or a
Yes.
smaller grouping or a grouping that's pretty consistent instead of just rolling something out to everybody.
Yes. The small subset is, you definitely need it to save yourself from, again, mistakes. Automation can break at any point in time. You're going to be experimenting. I tell people all the time, make sure you have your leadership on board to know that there is always a risk when you do this. And that way they're aligned and they're just not throwing their hands up in the air that, hey, what happened? You have to make sure that they understand the risks. But when you have that smaller subset of accounts, that's where you have a little bit more control, and then you could understand, and it's not totally impacting the overall population. When I first did our first Tech Touch program, it was like 60 accounts. Then we rolled it out to like over 50% of the business, and it was like 700 plus companies that were in that program. So start small and then kind of scale up from there.
And I totally recommend building reports where nobody
Yeah.
should show up on them. And if they do, there's a
Yes.
problem. A really great way to think about that is like, who's getting emails that has an account associated with them that's not a customer?
Mm-hmm.
And then you can see, okay, is our customer status flag contradicting what we have in the contract data? That's another great one is prospects do we have that have an active contract or vice versa? Like just really think through what should never happen, make a dashboard, and then have it emailed to you on a regular basis, if nothing else.
Love it. Yeah. When I work with people, I tell them all the time, create these audit reports. One of them, a good example too, it's like, especially if you're firing off like crucial steps in your account journey, onboarding, renewal. We were using Marketo at the time, so we had to kind of have a hacky way of bringing
Oh,
in
yeah.
tasks, right? Like in order to say like an email was fired. And we had an audit report where it's like, all right, hey, they're past the 90-day mark and there's no task with XYZ title or subject line. that fired. And then we would have to kind of manually push them through or so on and so forth. But yeah, audit reports are crucial when you're running automation.
I think this is a great time for you to tell us about your podcast and where we can find you.
Definitely. So I do have the Customer Unsuccess podcast. Kamala's been on it as well, and we're excited to hear her story. But it's all about the stories of things that did not go well and go to market and customer success, and essentially what the learning lessons were. So that would have been tech implementations that went awry, or a difficult customer renewal, or maybe just to get a deal across the line and it may have blown up down at the finish line, whatever that might be. And then we just kind of recap it as far as what those key takeaways are. So if you want to check that out, that's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts as well. So all the typical channels there. You can find me on LinkedIn at I forget the actual extension, but I just know it's Joe DeGrande.
We'll include the link in the show notes. So
definitely
don't stress out too much.
But it's Joe DeGrande. So you'll have that there. I also have my new newsletter where we focus on, for post sales and like CS operations and different ways in which you could automate your post sales function.
Joe, it's been great having you on the show. We need to have you on some webinars, and we'll catch you around the community.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOps AF, y'all.